My name's Oliver Emberton. I'm the Managing Director of Silktide, and today I'm going to be covering the topic of web accessibility for content editors. So just to let you know in advance, this is being recorded. I'm sure someone will ask me that at the end anyway, but it is being recorded. There will be a roughly 45-minute talk and a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. Let me just move this out of the way. Right. If you hadn't heard, I am, in addition to being the Managing Director at Silktide, I'm also the author of this forthcoming book, Web Accessibility Made Easy, which is, I believe, the only book on WCAG 2.1. That's the official standard that you have to follow as of September for all UK websites. So this is kind of my thing. If you want to ask me any awkward questions at the end, please be my guest. So what are we covering today? Well, we're going to take a broad look at accessibility as a whole, but we're going to focus on the areas that concern content editors. And there are 4 types of accessibility I specifically want to focus on. For each one of those, we're going to look at how they affect people and what you specifically can do about it. It's going to be a very practical session, and there is absolutely zero technical knowledge required whatsoever. I mean, I say that, I'm assuming you can operate a computer, keyboard, and a mouse, but that's about it. So this will be hopefully quite easy going. Nevertheless, we are going to go quite deep into a number of topics. So just to frame the conversation very quickly, what do we mean by accessibility? Well, you probably already know, but a lot of people would describe it as something like what you see here. So web accessibility, meaning people with disabilities can use the web equally. Now, this is a valid description, and in fact, we're citing the official body that runs the internet pretty much here, so that they know what they're talking about. But we would actually argue there's a slightly more nuanced and appropriate definition. The trouble is, when people think of disability, they think of pretty much one of these icons, right? They think of someone who's, say, in a wheelchair or deaf or blind or whatever. And whilst that is a genuine thing, and it is something you want to be aware of, it's quite a limiting definition for disability. So we prefer to think of it more on a continuum, like you're going to see here. And we're going to go through these 4 areas on the left, so hearing, visual, motor, and cognitive. But if you think of them as being on a spectrum, ranging from permanent disabilities, which are the traditional things you might think of, such as deafness or blindness, through temporary impairments, which can be things that someone has on a short-term basis, such as they may have broken an arm, or they may have an ear infection. And then finally, situational impairments, which are going to be things like someone is in a loud room, or they're just trying to walk and use their phone at the same time. Those in many ways do actually mirror each other, and we'll see this as we go into these in a bit more detail, how something as simple as being in a loud room can be in many ways equivalent to being deaf, and many of the same accessibility approaches are applicable to all of these situations. The other reason to think about it, of course, is because everyone experiences situational disability, which really means accessibility affects everyone. So, why does accessibility matter? Well, you probably already know, because if you didn't, you wouldn't be here, but very, very quickly, there are 4 main reasons. Firstly, you're going to maximize the number of people that you reach. And here's a photo that we don't see very often nowadays. Some remarkable how quickly that one got dated. Yes, 1 in 5 people approximately has a quote unquote traditional definition of a disability. That number is almost certainly a dramatic underestimation, of course, of the number of people who are affected by these issues, because as we just saw, they don't just affect people with permanent disabilities, but also situational and temporary impairments. Secondly, it's something that will improve the user experience. This guy here is, to some extent, actually having a compromised situational experience. And his usability of your website or your mobile app or whatever is actually improved by the same measures that would help everyone else. It's a legal requirement as of this September for all UK public sector websites, with some very small exceptions in specific content types, to have to comply with legal requirements for web accessibility. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then finally, if that doesn't persuade you, really, it's the right thing to do. This is something that actually really makes a measurable impact in the quality of life of millions of people, and especially in the current climate that we're facing with social distancing and people being more reliant on the internet, it's never been more important. So let's dive into the actual meat of today. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be focusing on these 4 main areas. And we're going to dive into each one, and we're going to look at how they can affect people, and also how they can affect, in particular, your work as a content editor on a website. So we're going to start with the easiest, and then we're going to work our way up gradually to the hardest. And the hardest is about 50% of the whole lot. So let's start off with something nice and easy, and that will be auditory. This is actually so easy, it's almost trivial, but it's a nice place to get started, I guess. Give some examples of auditory impairments. So you can think of auditory impairment as running on this continuum. A situational impairment would be something like you're in a loud room, or perhaps more commonly, you're in a quiet room. So say you're in a library, you're not able to actually listen to the sound on your phone or computer or laptop or tablet, whatever it is. If you're in public, generally, you're waiting at a train station, you're probably not going to have sound. So a permanent disability, of course, might be that you're deaf, but in this case, from the perspective of being a user of a website, these two things are actually basically equivalent. You simply don't have the ability to hear. And that is something that everyone, I imagine here, has experienced quite extensively. It's just turning the sound off on, say, your phone. 85% of Facebook video is watched without sound. So the 5 people, at least in this shot here, are all almost certainly working on their phones, unless they're really, really rude people. We don't like them, with sound off. And they may well be enjoying the latest movie trailers or playing a game or whatever, but they're not able to experience sound in that moment. So whatever experience they're having needs to work without sound in that situation. Again, this is almost so obvious, you kind of take it for granted, but it's a good place to start. Of course, 19% of the UK suffers from hearing loss. It's actually one of the most common disabilities. So it's also worth bearing that in mind. But we know how people manage because, again, you do it every day. You work with captions. Chances are, if you're watching a movie trailer or a funny video or something on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, chances are you've got captions in it. There's a reason that nowadays, if a movie studio is releasing a trailer, that they will be absolutely certain to edit it in a way that not only is it square video, but it's also captioned so you can enjoy it without sound, without even turning captions on. This has become standard because it's the standard way we consume that kind of material. But the same approach works for someone who is deaf and has no other choice. So there's that approach. The other approach, of course, is you can provide a transcript. So if you've got something like a podcast here or a video, a lot of people like to copy and paste out a transcript of the material and include it. That's also good for other reasons. Some people just prefer that. It's great for search engines. So you'll see this pattern across everything that we're going to dive into today. A lot of the things that you would do for quote unquote accessibility will significantly aid all of your users as a whole. So what should you do? Well, from a legal basis, it's really quite simple. If you have audio only content, you want to be adding a transcript. If you have audio and video content, you want a transcript and captions. That will allow anyone with any number of the preceding conditions to consume your content. There are some exemptions in the case of UK public sector. For example, live video is not expected to be covered by that. But generally, if you're looking at pre-recorded material, you want to be having a text equivalent of that multimedia. And then just a little quick note here on what we mean by captions, because people get captions and subtitles mixed up quite a lot. So just to clarify, subtitles are what you see here. So subtitle is where you take what a person is saying and you write it on the screen, right? So Anna is saying, "What a beautiful day." Captions is where you describe any key pertinent information. So in this case, there happens to be a train approaching. And that, of course, changes very much your interpretation of this scene. So where the absence of audio would cause some lapse in understanding. You would expect to provide that additional contextual information, and that is captions. So when you hear the term closed captions, that literally just means captions that are not written on the video, but then they can optionally turn on and off. So that's what you want to be aiming for. And from a technical angle, it's very easy to do. If your CMS or your video editing or whatever lets you do it, it's usually incredibly straightforward. Maybe you don't work with video, not a problem. Or you can just, if this fails, you can just add a transcript at the bottom. Anyway, that's auditory. That's the nice and easy one. We're going to move on because it's going to get quite a bit harder. Cognitive. So cognitive impairments, again, looking on a continuum, we run from situational all the way through temporary to permanent. And you'll recognize many of these. This is, of course, not an exhaustive list, but a situational cognitive impairment might be that you're trying to use a website and you have a screaming child in the background. If that's happening, good luck. It's obviously, it's still possible, but you are compromised in a very real way. And it's just harder to do. And that is actually kind of an analog for a lot of the other conditions you might experience, whether they be something temporary like anxiety, or you're going all the way up to, say, someone with ADHD or even Alzheimer's. It's obviously not directly equivalent, but very much the approach for how you think about it and tackle these will be similar. So to go into some specifics, let's take a look at what some of this is actually like. We're going to start with dyslexia. Now, dyslexia affects 10% of the people in the UK. And it's actually something that, to be honest, it's surprisingly hard to get your head around. So we built a simulator that I'm going to show you that you can try yourself. So you can actually kind of experience what it's like to use the web with dyslexia. And the basic idea is a little bit like what you're seeing on this picture on the right. I don't know if you recognize it, but this is gov.uk, and it's their coronavirus page. But of course, all the letters are scrambled up. Now, one of the effects of dyslexia, and this is kind of a crude approximate, but it's close enough, is that the letters get jumbled. And the thing that this picture is not showing is those letters continue to jumble as you're looking at them. So to appreciate this properly, we built this free toolbar. I'll give you this link a couple of times in this talk because we're going to use it quite a bit, but it's completely free. It's a Chrome plugin. So if you need to be using Chrome as your browser, and you simply go to silktide.com/toolbar and follow the instructions. It takes like a minute. But anyway, I'll show you how it works now. We're going to use it to look at a web page and experience a little bit of dyslexia. So let's do that. Come out of here and let's go into web browser. And here we go. Here's gov.uk. Let me, hold on, move this panel out of the way. 1 second. And okay. So what I have here in the top right corner, I don't know if you can see this, is a little S icon. That's our company logo, Silktide. And once you've installed the toolbar, you'll just have this icon in the top right corner. And at any time you want to experience a page like this with a simulated disability, if you click on this, we'll open a little window. You can move this around, get it out of the way if you want. And you can choose what you want to look at, but we're going to focus on dyslexia for now. You just click this button to turn it on. And then I'm just going to click this like minimize button to kind of hide it. So hopefully you can see that. There might be a bit of lag on the screen share, but what should be happening is you should see this web page, but all of the letters are kind of moving as you look at them. So this is a reasonable approximation of what dyslexia is like. Now, it's not perfect, but it gives you a feel. One of the first things to kind of note here is you can still read everything, pretty much. I mean, like I can read this, the best place to find government services and information, simpler, clearer, faster. So it's possible, but it's just a little bit harder. You have to exert your mind a bit more. You have to really think about it. And you maybe have to kind of, do a bit of a double take, maybe go, oh, I don't get that word, I'll skip past it, I'll come back to it, that kind of thing. So this is actually a really good analog for a lot of the other experiences that you want to appreciate with regards to cognitive accessibility, because essentially that is the problem. People have to just think harder to do the same thing. And people have a finite tolerance for exerting themselves. So at a certain point, they'll just be like, this is too hard, I'm not going to bother. Now, this particular page, gov.uk, is actually brilliantly designed for accessibility. It is, in fact, almost certainly one of the best in the world. As far as government websites, certainly it's exceptionally well done. And they are doing just about everything you could possibly do right on this page, even though it may not look obvious. They have used headings here to make the clear information you want to scan immediately apparent. So even if you're struggling to read the individual letters or words, you can immediately see what you should look at first. So you know, for example, to read this text, but not to worry about reading this text up front, right? It's very obvious that there's a search box here and you can see it straight away, even if you didn't read the word search. I didn't need to read the word search because it was obvious visually and so on. So there's a lot of stuff they're doing right here. They use things like broken out figures, short paragraphs of text, headings, imagery, and so on to complement the text that they know may in some ways be compromised like this. So just to contrast that, if I turn this off 1 second, and then if I go into a different website, so this is a little unfair, but I'm just going to pick on this website. It's a legal website, so their text is kind of hideous, but it's not really their fault, and it is a legal document. So this is just, imagine you're looking at something like this, right? And actually, to be fair, this is still punctuated. This at least has, broken into the bullets and paragraphs. But try and read something like this under these conditions. It's just so much harder. And silly things that may seem like, oh, okay, that sentence could be a bit easier to read. It suddenly becomes a lot more apparent when you're in this in a simulator, are far more demanding to some people than you may realize. So quite useful there. Let's go back to our slides. Right, so that was dyslexia. I also just want to show you one other cognitive condition quickly. This is approximately, and I emphasize very approximately, an analog to attention ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. So what we're going to see here, it's definitely not a medically sound simulation of that, but it's simulating almost a cognitive load again that would be experienced. So the idea here is you're going to see me try and use a web page to complete some simple oh, sorry, no, actually, first you're going to see that picture, because this is actually a pretty good simulation in some ways. If you've ever had a screaming child bouncing on your lap and you're trying to take a phone call and also use a website, that's actually not a terrible simulation either. But what we're going to look at is this one, which was put together by WebAIM. They're a organization that focuses on web accessibility. And they made this distractibility simulation. And it's really kind of a game. But what they do is they get you to use a fictional website, and you're supposed to complete some very basic tasks. You don't need to read all this on the screen, but you're going to complete some very basic tasks. The trouble is, while you're trying to complete the tasks, you're going to be distracted by trying to sort of play a game at the same time. So they're going to have these bombs fall from the top of the screen, and I have to move a character from left and right to try and catch the bombs whilst I am simultaneously using the website to complete some tasks. So obviously this isn't exactly what many medical conditions might be like, but it is actually analogous to the experience, which is to say your brain is going to be very distracted, and it's going to be put under unusually high levels of duress whilst trying to perform what might seem otherwise relatively straightforward tasks. So let's get it started. So you can see me trying to catch the bombs here on the bottom right-hand corner, moving from side to side. And the top right, I've got a list of tasks I'm supposed to complete. So I'm supposed to click on a center director's email address, but I've got to try and read this page and try and figure out where that is whilst oh, no, I'm dead. Well, there you go, right? So, okay, so I know where to go now. I'm going to go on this contact us page. I'm looking for the center director's email, but I'm trying to catch these bombs. So the problem again here is, if you can imagine, your eyes are darting back and forth and back and forth. Now I'm trying to complete this survey page, and I'm clicking on things, but they're not working. I don't know why. And again, I failed. I lost. It's actually kind of fun if you want to play with that. It kind of gives you a bit of an insight into some of the things that may seem innocuous, but actually make a difference. But in both of these cases, what you're actually seeing is really just a simulation of the idea of having a high cognitive load, right? You're having different types, but you're seeing your brain is just having to work that much harder to do things you might take for granted. And this is similar to many other situations that people may find themselves in. For example, non-native language speakers, which are 7.7% of the UK. People with low literacy, attention deficits, forgetfulness, people who are tired or ill or distracted or even drunk, heaven forbid. And in all of those cases, those people are experiencing potentially significantly more energy is having to go into their cognitive process, right? So the solution for this is basically to be simple and clear. It sounds obvious and everyone thinks those things are good anyway, but to actually take it to the level that many of these websites do is surprisingly difficult. At a high level, you want to be writing super clearly, avoiding those unnecessary words, jargon, obviously, and if you have to use jargon, always defining it. Certainly avoiding the use of lofty, superfluous prose. Breaking up your text is so important here, not just because it looks good, but because it genuinely aids in lowering the cognitive strain on people who are trying to consume your content. It's good for everyone just to make it easy to understand, but it makes such a huge difference if you're suffering from one of these conditions. So yeah, so headings, bullets, images in particular, ease comprehension. Just as an example, compare these two. Here on the left, we have some slightly flowery prose: in the event of a vehicular collision, a company assigned representative will seek to ascertain the extent and so on. And this is terrible, obviously. And the same content can be written in a much clearer way through the use of bullets and simpler, plain, direct English. And in this case, also adding a slightly relevant diagram that kind of supports the messaging being made just makes it so much easier for everyone to follow. And in fact, if you were to see the same text with a little bit of dyslexia, you really can appreciate it. Again, just imagine you have to read that text on the left and how much patience you're going to have for that text. Whereas what's on the right, although it's still demanding, is clearly much easier to appreciate. So that was cognitive. So next we're going to move on to motor. Motor's a little different. It's going to be more of an appreciation rather than a practical session, you'll see. So I'm just going to quickly frame this. What do I mean by motor impairments? Well, this is where people have some motor difficulty that impairs their use of a traditional input method. So for example, they may struggle to use a keyboard or a mouse or a touchscreen or whatever device that you're expecting them to use when they're operating, say, your website. Now, this sounds simple, but the specifics get some kind of tricky. So let's take a look at a few of those. So the easiest example situationally would be something like you're trying to use a website, you're walking down the street, maybe trying to catch a train, and you're using it one-handed at the same time. That's a really common thing, or at least it was before we shut the entire world down. Temporary, yes, of course, you might have something like a broken arm. And permanent, well, there's a huge range of conditions here, and we'll just cover a couple. But things like tremors make it significantly more difficult to actually just operate something like a mouse or even tap on a link on your website. With other conditions, you'll see the nature of your website becomes very different, and it has to be used in a fundamentally different way you probably aren't aware of. And we'll take a look at that. So let's see, what is this actually like for people in the real world? Well, if you're this guy, this is perhaps a little contrived example. I'm assuming he's either really talented or he's had a really bad superglue accident, but he's obviously trying to use a website and simultaneously is bouncing a ball and walking down the street. So in this case, his cognition, you could argue, was actually compromised, but also certainly his motor coordination would be slightly less than it would otherwise be. Common injuries such as, for example, breaking an arm. What was it? The average person breaks, I believe, 2 limbs in their lifetime. So if you happen to break an arm, it's just harder to do certain things. You know, for example, using a phone with 2 hands suddenly becomes a lot trickier, or if not impossible. Tremors, of course, we're getting to something significantly more challenging. In this case, some people will just struggle to use a machine. So, for example, if you watch someone who has tremors use a mouse and they try and double click on something, it's very hard, because they'll click on something and then they'll kind of move the mouse before they click it again. So the computer won't see that as like click, click. It'll see it as like click and like drag. And that's one of the reasons we very rarely double click anymore, in case you're wondering. But on websites, this can cause all sorts of problems, and there are usually alternative technologies used to supplement their use of a website as a result. And then if you get to something really severe, you're looking at something like the late Stephen Hawking, who, it's worth remembering, was able to be a titan in his field. He was able to contribute spectacular works of science and literature whilst having almost no motor function whatsoever. And I can hardly think of a better testament to the importance of accessible technology than some of the what he accomplished. So it's going to be interesting, but I'll show you how he was actually able to do that and what that means for the accessibility of your website. So how do people manage these kind of conditions? Well, if you're just dealing with something like walking down the street, the most likely solution is you just get really pissed off and you probably repeat what you're doing. This is actually much the same for someone who may have a more severe disability. Often they are just repeating and getting annoyed, but your tolerance for this is probably lower, and you, as a result, are probably affecting everyone with these inconveniences. A classic example would be something like this: website nicely designed for mobile on the left. That's fine. You could be walking and catching a train and scrolling through it, no problem. Website on the right, give me a break. I can't click on anything. I have to try and use both hands to pinch to zoom. It's really awkward. It's annoying. If I've got a broken arm or something, that becomes a significant problem. For what it's worth, that kind of mobile layout is literally prohibited by the new accessibility guidelines that kick in September. And it's something we specialize in testing. So if you're curious, we can talk later. This is a lesser known accessible technology. If you've never seen this, there are videos online. A mouse stick is pretty much what it looks like. If you only have movement limited to your upper extremities, so for example, you can move your head, move your mouth, you can use this as a technology to operate a keyboard or potentially a touchscreen. It is about as difficult as it looks, or you can imagine. Again, I recommend checking out a video if you're really interested. The key thing here is, imagine you're trying to operate a computer and all you can do is use individual keys. You can't even use a mouse in this case, clearly. So you may even wonder, how is that possible? Well, I'm going to show you. And it's the same kind of as it is for, say, Stephen Hawking in this example. He, in the later stages of his life, he was only able to move muscles in his cheek and, well, able to move muscles in his cheek sufficiently, I should say. And so he had an infrared sensor attached to his glasses. You can just about see in this frame here. And what it was doing is it was monitoring his cheek muscles, and he was able to control a computer by essentially twitching his cheek. Now, there are variations of this. There are similar sensors you can wear on your neck that listen to the vibrations of your voice, for example. There are all sorts. But the point is, you may be wondering, how on earth is it possible to even use a computer or a web browser or write text when all you have is that kind of limited range of movement? Again, the answer is kind of the same as it was before. And then here's one final example, eye tracking, where in this case, this child is, I don't know if you can see, there's a camera below that screen. This child is able to operate essentially a screen keyboard by looking at keys. And indeed, this is a increasingly common accessible technology where, again, if your range of movement is limited, you can use your eyes to essentially stare at what you want and then use, for example, blinks in order to select things. It comes with a whole range of additional problems, but what it really comes down to with all of these is that you have to be able to reduce the use of your website to pretty much these 3 buttons. Now, I am simplifying a little bit for our purposes, but it's worth understanding how that works and why. So if you imagine all of those technologies, they can pretty much be mapped to a succession of buttons. In some cases, like here, you'll have more, and that's great. We'll see how that gets used as well. But something like this, you can pretty much go, as long as I can select the next thing or the previous thing, work through a list and then select something, I can pretty much use a website. And in fact, you may not know this, but there is a way you can do it right now on your own computer. If you've never tried this before, it's called tabbed browsing, and I'm going to just quickly show you how it works. There are these simple free keyboard shortcuts. Now, these are not the shortcuts that someone with, say, a mouse stick would actually be using. These would be simplified. They may have alternative inputs. But for your perspective, if you try this out, it'll give you much the same experience. So if you kind of remember those, you're going to use Tab to go forward, Shift and Tab to go back, and Enter to select. And I will show you how that works in the real world. So let's leave this lovely website. And in fact, I'm going to use Gov UK again because it's great. So they do pretty much everything right here. So if I press Tab, it'll start here, and I can press Tab and skip forward, press Tab and skip forward, press Tab and skip forward. And so I'm just going next, 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 basically. And as I do so, it steps through each part of the page, and I can do this until I can literally reach every single part of the page that I want. I mean, it's obviously exhausting. This is a challenging activity for me and my fingers even. And imagine if you were using something like a mouse stick or whatever, this would be significantly more difficult. But yeah, I can go in here and then I can select something, press Enter. That takes me to that page. And then I can repeat the process. So this is literally how a huge swathe of accessible technologies essentially work. I mean, they're not using those keys, but they map to those keys, so it's the same effect. So if you want to get a feel for how your website works like this, it's really simple. Literally just go to your website, start pressing the Tab button, and you should expect some experience similar to what you're seeing here. But nearly every website isn't going to do it as well as this one. Gov UK has really gone the extra mile, and they've made everything super clear, and it's very legible what's happening. A lot of websites will not do that. Many will fail to do this at all, in which case I have a real accessibility problem. Right. So the thing is, unlike everything else we're going to talk about, motor accessibility is usually outside of the content editor's remit. So it's definitely worth having an awareness of, but you usually can't control it or overly contribute to it through the editing of pages. There are a few things, however, to be aware of, and this is really just for your organization's health as a whole. You should definitely test your website with tab browsing, because that is equivalent to a lot of those technologies. You should avoid 2D scrolling. So what I mean by that is, if you have, I think we had a picture earlier, if you have something like this, where the only way to look at text is to scroll up and down and left and right, so you'd have to zoom in on this right-hand side page. That is two-dimensional scrolling, and that's very, very bad. It's hard for everyone to use, but if you have like a motor condition or whatever, it's next to impossible, because you need those additional controls to now control your scrolling left to right as well as up to down, and you're jumping all over the place, and it's just so much harder to follow what's going on. And again, that's one of the reasons why that's now a accessibility requirement from September. And then obviously you just want to make sure things are large enough to tap or click. I think someone once said that the 3 smallest things in the universe are, I believe, the electron, was it the proton, whatever, the electron, the quark, and the close button on a mobile banner advertisement. And I think we can all relate to that, but it's one thing for it to just be an annoyance for many people. It's literally preventing them from using your site. Anyway, so that concludes auditory, motor, and cognitive, just leaving one left, visual. But visual is the most demanding. So let's take a quick look. It's also definitely the most applicable to content editors. So you're going to get quite a lot of actions out of this one. How it affects people, well, you can imagine situationally. You can have situations like you've got glare on your screen, your mobile phone, you're out in the park, when we used to do that, and or you might just have broken your screen, maybe you've dropped your phone, you've lost your glasses, and then there's a whole raft of permanent conditions which range all from mild colorblindness all the way up to total blindness. And I just want to show you a few of those, and then we'll look at how that affects the way that you put together content on your site. So if we were to consider normal vision, let's just take this photo here. This is a nice example. I'm going to contrast this with some different visions. So this is the same image, but with one of the more common forms of color blindness applied. Now, it's quite mild in this case. So you'll just notice there's a loss of certain color definition and contrast, but it's not too severe. You'll notice there's a wide range of different types of color blindness. It's actually kind of crazy. There's no way you could possibly expect to know what they're all going to do and how it would work. Here's another one by contrast. You'll notice quite a significantly different visual range. But Again, you don't really need to care, as you'll see, because what this really means is you're just going to have to ignore the use of color, as you'll see in a minute. A very common condition, up to 50% of people actually, depending on your country, suffer from myopia of some form, is short-sightedness. So basically your vision is blurred if things are up close. Now, of course, most of these people will have some kind of glasses or contacts to aid them. Doesn't mean they'll necessarily have access to those all the time, of course, but it's a relatively minor impediment for most people. However, it is similar, very similar, to a much more severe cataracts. Now, cataracts are basically is the same kind of visual effect in the sense you lose focus, but the problem is you can't correct it. You can't wear glasses to fix this. So just imagine your vision is permanently blurred. That's roughly what cataracts looks like. This is obviously quite severe. You wouldn't expect to make every web page work for someone with a visual field like this perfectly, but you'd be surprised how many people are actually able to use the web, as you'll see, even though they may be totally blind. Glaucoma, of course, is basically a form of tunnel vision. It's where the outer range of your visual field is lost. And so you have detail in the middle of your visual field, but you lose peripheral vision. It's an inconvenience, but it's usually not too, well, you'll see in a minute, too debilitating from the perspective of a website. But then macular degeneration, which is usually highly correlated with age, this is awful. This is where you essentially lose the center of your visual field. So that's where the area you would expect the most detail in your sight has essentially faded away. So these people only have peripheral vision. And there are many, many more of these, of course, the most severe, total blindness. So one of the reasons why that stuff matters is because people have things like this. They have a website on the left and they go, oh, this website's so ugly and we hate it, it's awful. And they redesign it and they come up with this nice new sexy design on the right. And this is actually an example from Google. So old design on the left, new design on the right, and then someone with even a slight visual impairment is completely and utterly stuffed because they can just about make out the left-hand side design, as ugly as it was, but the new soft gray, subtle design is now completely impenetrable to them. How do people manage with these problems? Well, the standard approach is just to make everything larger. And fortunately, a lot of us have devices now that make that easy. If you're using a phone or a tablet, your pretty standard feature is to pinch and zoom. There's actually hardware for this, as you can see. You can literally get things that will magnify your screen. And there's software as well. So you can be using your web browser and pinch to zoom or use a magnifying tool, and there's all sorts of other similar tools. But they all work on the same principle. They take a page like this and they'll magnify it, right? But if you design your website correctly, as we'll see here, what will happen is as you zoom in, the page makes perfect sense. So you can see from here, zooming in to here, everything still works. It all fits. It looks good. It's easy to understand. Everything's clear. A bad version of that experience, which I have contrived to demonstrate, because this is not how the BBC actually works, would be if I took my page here and I zoomed in and it all kind of got chopped off on the side, right? So I'm now forced to scroll again. There's a common problem you see on mobile sites. We have a site that fits like this on the left and on the right it doesn't. It's one of those conditions where sometimes content editors can cause this because they can inject content into their pages that breaks the layout. So for example, you might add a video that's too wide or an image that's too wide. Usually, if your CMS is good, not a problem, but something to bear in mind. Another way people cope is if their vision is genuinely so severely impacted that they cannot see at all. So some of the conditions you saw earlier, they may use a Braille display. So a Braille display essentially reads the content of the screen and describes it to them in text. I don't have enough time to go into this in any real detail, but what I am going to focus on is a screen reader, which is much the same thing, quite a bit more common. And a screen reader is technology that's used by a huge range of people who have any number of impairments, whether it just be, it can in fact be dyslexia, or it can range all the way up to total blindness. And essentially it's technology that reads out audibly what is on the screen in a way that even if you couldn't see the screen, you could still use the computer. This is quite shocking technology if you've never used it before, and I'm going to give you a quick demonstration. Again, coming back to what we looked at earlier, we have a free simulator. It's the same tool that you saw earlier. And we have a blindness mode that will completely simulate, if you wish, using a website as if you were blind. So I'm going to use that now. Let's go into, I think this time I'll take a different website. Let's go to BBC News and hopefully I won't be too horrified. Let's have a look. Right. So if I open a toolbar again in the same way, you'll notice, by the way, you've got things in here like a colorblindness simulator. So if you want, you can try different kinds of colorblindness if you're curious. And you can try cataracts out as well. So just turn it on. There you go. So like a loss of vision here. You can turn on tunnel, call it tunnel just to make it short in here, but it's things like loss of peripheral vision. So that's like you saw earlier. And you can turn on loss of central vision. And then I've got blindness, which is what we want to look at. So I'm just going to turn this on quickly. And what this does, and the way a screen reader works, is it reads out a thing at a time on a page, and it lets you navigate to the next thing or the previous thing and select them. So it's very, very similar to what you saw earlier with tabbed browsing. So if I use this next button, and I can turn on sound, but I don't think you'll hear it. So I think yeah, I don't think that's going to read out for you guys in a way you can hear because of the way WebEx works. But essentially, if you click this button, the computer will speak what it says in this box here. And I'm just going to show you. So at the moment, it's got this homepage link selected. And if I clicked next, it tells me I've got accessibility link selected. Next, there's a list with 2 items. Next, the first item is skip to content. Next, the second item is accessibility help, and so on. So I could click this a lot. And I don't know if you can see, we've got a little red box here at the top showing what's selected. Now, of course, if you were using a real screen reader, you wouldn't see anything. In fact, we even let you simulate that. You can literally turn off the vision if you want. It's quite hard, of course, to use a computer with no sight, but it is possible. And this is the way it works. You literally step through things in the same way, and you would hear them read out. And if you wanted to click on something, so I want to click on, let's say, Wales, I just click select, and then that clicks on that, and it's nice and simple. So it is, it seems almost insurmountable if you imagine that, but you had to listen to every word being read out. That would be very demanding. And so the way screen readers get around that is they provide additional shortcuts that do more. So there's quite a few of these, but the gist would be a lot of the time they're going to skip to links, or they're going to skip to headings on a page in order to navigate it. So what I mean by that is, let's say I press H. That skips me to my headings. I don't know if you can see this, but there we go. So I've skipped to this heading with just 4 button presses. Coronavirus in Wales, don't have a blanket ban for older people. Next, related content, murder attempt after stabbing at shop. And I can select that. And so on, right? So this is a much more common way of navigating a page, is not just to step through each individual link or each individual thing on a page, but to literally go, give me the next link, give me the next heading, go back a heading, that kind of thing. This is the way that someone who's blind or heavily compromised will typically experience your site. Right, let's go back. So what does that mean for you? Well, the first things to bear in mind is just avoid relying on color. This is an actual chart, I think, published by someone or other, government or whatever, I can't remember. But the problem with this chart is it's just about followable if you have normal color. But if you don't, this is extreme, of course, I've turned off all the color. But if you can't see color, that graph is pretty much dead to you. So ideally, if you're doing something like this, don't just rely on color. You might, for example, have used dots for, in this case, I think it's Florida, and maybe used a cross for a different symbol for a different state, that kind of thing. There's just other ways to make your charts and so on accessible. Avoid describing things in a way that assumes vision. So saying things like click on a button on the right or click on a blue button, just try and avoid that, because of course not everyone's actually going to see it. Clicking on a blue button is particularly useless. Something like click on the start button, for example, will work regardless of whether someone actually has normal vision. Page titles, I'm sure you have heard of, and as content editors, I'm sure you write them all the time. But it's worth understanding why they matter and how you can make them good. This, if you didn't know, is a page title, this text here in a tab. When you specify a title for a page, this is where it will end up appearing. It will also end up appearing in Google. So when you Google for something, you'll find this blue text here is the title of these pages. And the idea is it's to give a summary of what the page is about. If you're in a screen reader, it's the first thing read out on the page. And so as a result, there are a few things that you want to consider when you're writing those titles. The first thing is you want to make sure your titles are unique. If every title of your page just said, let's say, go back here, the NHS website, you would have no idea where you're at, and you'd have to listen to the whole page be read out until you got to a point where you'd understand what the site is about, which is not very helpful. So having a useful title that's unique, it makes a big difference. You want to put the most unique information first. Someone who's using a screen reader is they're not going to listen to everything being read out. They're going to go next, 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 next all the time, because they're going to get very tired of listening to these words. So if you write something like man bites dog -BBC News, that's good. If you wrote BBC News -man bites dog, you're putting the headline, the important information, second, and you're making them wait a lot longer to get to it. So that's not good. And if you've got a multi-step process, so if you've got something like apply for a passport, you want to define what those steps are, your progress in the title. Again, the reason why this matters is because it's literally the first thing read out to someone using accessible technology. It's what they're going to hear first. Right, headings. So headings, you've probably heard headings. You may or may not know them from a technical angle, but from a user angle, they're pretty straightforward. You see an article like this, and the heading is kind of the level of the heading, where like heading 1 is the thing at the top, heading 2 is the thing inside heading 1, heading 3 is the thing inside heading 2, and so on. And so a document like this would have a sort of a hierarchy, if you will, like the series of bullets you see here on the right-hand side. Headings, of course, just generally great. They make content easy to understand, but they have very important, have great particular importance in accessibility. I mean, if you imagine a page like this, sure, if you're looking at dyslexia and a range of other conditions, it's just easier to follow the text on the right than it is to follow the text on the left. But when you're looking in a screen reader, and actually I showed you this earlier, using the H key will skip you forward to the next heading. A very standard way of, say, using something like Google is to load Google and immediately go heading, heading, heading until you find the results you want and press them. And most screen reader users are not going to listen to every single word on the page to get there. So if they were using this design on the left, they would literally have to have everything read out to know where they're at. Whereas if they're using that design on the right, they can just press the H key and go straight to the relevant headings and skip to where they want to get to. So that just means using what's called semantic headings. Your CMS will vary, but they'll usually call it something like heading 1, heading 2. What you don't want to do is just use bold or big text. That will get you in trouble. It may look like a heading, it has no effect on accessibility. So don't just go, I've got bold text in there, that's no good. You need to literally select a heading specifically. You want to nest them correctly, as I showed you earlier, and you want to think of them as bookmarks within a page. Whatever the text is inside them, that's something that someone can skip to. So making it short and self-evident really helps. Alternative text, or if you're cool, what we call alt text. I'm sure you've all heard, and you've probably got the option in your CMS. The idea, of course, and again, I suspect you know this, is you have images like this, and alternative text is what's read out when a screen reader is looking at the page. So, of course, a person can't see that there is a pear, but the computer can say pear image, or banana image, apple image. Again, I could show you that. Probably don't really have time to show you right now, but in a screen reader, just imagine you selecting images, having that read out. The problem here, of course, is the alternative text is anything that you set as a content editor. So if you set all of that text to image, then they're going to get a very unhelpful experience where it's just going to say image, 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 image. Not very helpful. Or you might just have wildly inconsistent and inappropriate alternative text like pear img72.jpg or photo of a banana lit from above. Here you can see that the level of detail or the kind of relevance of that alternative text isn't really appropriate for the context of, in this case, choosing between these 3 options. The other thing to note is that alternative text is not always a good thing. A lot of people think they have to add alt text for all their images. This is absolutely not the case. In fact, it can be quite a bad thing for you to do that. I'll give you a very quick example. Imagine that these 4 icons or these 4 options from this talk were on a web page and I wanted to make them accessible. You might think you add alt text for all of those icons, and you would be terribly, terribly wrong. If I was to do so, we would get something like this. It would say, ear receiving sound, image, auditory, link, or eye crossed out, image, visual, link. And this is how a screen reader would see this. And a user trying to interpret this is like, wait, what's going on? Like, why do they care that there's a finger pointing image next to motor link? The information they care about in this case is only the link. The image doesn't actually help. In fact, if anything, it detracts from the important information because it's decorative, essentially. It's just adding, a little bit of color or imagery to the page. So in this case, you'd actually want to set the alternative text for those 4 images to be nothing on purpose. And you would instead have a much better experience like this. To give you another very quick example, imagine you've got this picture of George Washington on the left-hand side. What do you think would be appropriate alternative text for this image? Well, we could say an image of George Washington, or it's George Washington, the first president of the United States. We could specify no alternative text, or we could just say George Washington. You have a guess in mind. You've got about 5 seconds to think about it. Use my excuse to take a drink. So the correct answer is D. And the reason is image of George Washington is redundant because, of course, the screen reader is going to say image anyway. George Washington, the first president of the United States, is repeating information in the text besides it. No alt text, well, you would lose the fact that there's George Washington there. So yeah, George Washington, nice and simple, right? But then the same situation, but let's just add the words George Washington underneath. So we've now added some text, like a caption, if you will, that's visible below the image. What would the appropriate alternative text be this time? And the answer is actually completely different. It is in fact no alt text, because now you'd be redundant. If you were to say George Washington, that's not helping anyone. So really, it's not as simple as just getting the right text in there. You do actually need some understanding of how it's going to be interpreted. If you've got information like this, where the text charging phone is, it's obviously not got much time to explain this, but charging phone is not particularly helpful, but plug cable into the bottom edge of the phone would actually help the user understand what they're supposed to get from the image. You want to bear that in mind. And so just to summarize that, make sure you get the content and the function of the image in place. Make sure if an image is linked, that you think of it as link text. So you want link text like order a new passport, not passport, because that way they know what the link would actually do, as opposed to knowing it's a picture of a passport. Never include the words image or picture or icon. If you're saying those things, you're just redundant, because it's going to say image of a car, image. You just want to say car, and avoid that redundant duplicated alternative text. And then I believe last of all, we have link text. So link text, again, not going to demonstrate in the screen reader, but you saw it earlier, is where you step through the text on a page, the links on a page. Frequently, those links will be read outside of context. What that means is someone on a screen reader does not see your layouts. They don't realize that this read more is below a heading, or they don't see that this button is to the right-hand side of some other piece of text or information. They're deprived of that context. So all they have is the link. So when you give them something like, please select from the following options, read more, all they're really going to hear is read more link, and read more link. It doesn't help them actually make a decision or know where they're going. This is really, really common. And the way you actually want to write link text is you want to make it just describe what the link points to. So something like latest news or contact us. You want to make sure it makes sense out of context. So you want things like apply for a driving license, not just apply. And you want to avoid ambiguous text. Things like click here, read more are always unhelpful. There are some technical solutions if you really, really, really need a link that looks like read more because there's no other room, but you want it to be accessible at the same time. There is a way to do that. That's kind of outside the remit of this talk. And it's not normally something a content editor would have to worry about. So that is all of the abilities and barriers. Just to very quickly recap, there is a nice cheat sheet here. This contains all of the points you saw earlier. So if you want to take a screenshot or whatever, that's just what we went through today. A couple of other suggestions. Please try simulations on your own website. We made this plugin, like I said, free for a reason. It's really good for raising awareness of the importance of these issues and just checking that everything in your site is actually working as you would hope it should. As SOC team members, you have access to free accessibility reports produced by my company, so I highly recommend you take advantage of them. Of course, we can also help you measure the full accessibility of your website and work on automating the improvement of that alongside your team. If that's something that interests you, please talk to me later. And that's it for today. So that was everything I wanted to cover other than Q&A. We have apparently only 5 minutes spare, but I'm sure we can run over a little bit if you want. I've left these links here at the bottom, silktide.com/toolbar for anyone who wants to get that toolbar. And also, if you haven't already seen where you rank on the index yet, if you go to that web address, you'll be able to see how you are doing, how accessible your site is already. So without further ado, I think I'm going to hand back, Lauren, if you're still there. Let's have a look.
Yep, so we've got 3 questions come up in the Q&A box. So the first one is, do you have any guidance on how to make maps or images of maps as accessible as possible?
It does depend on the specifics of the map, annoyingly. So, for example, Google Maps, it's quite challenging. Well, it's not quite challenging. It's almost impossible because it's Google Maps. You can't control it. Whereas if you, say, had a single picture of a map and you're using what's called an area, which is like a way of like carving up the image to say, for example, this bit, this thumb icon or whatever is when clicked on does something, you can use that to kind of annotate parts of an image. You could alternatively use something called SVG, which is a file format for images that does allow you to add alternative text to parts of the image. They can get quite complicated. They're not super hard or anything, but they're just slightly outside the remit of this talk. But I'd be happy to talk to you about them separately if you want. Send me an email.
And the next question is, oh, sorry.
Next question, you go.
When we don't use alt text, then accessibility audit tools will pick this up as an error. How do we deal with this situation?
Well, you should clearly be using a better accessibility audit tool because, for one, ours doesn't do that. No. So the thing is, not having alternative text there's different ways of doing it. So if you specify alternative text, I kind of have to show you the code for this, but like alt equals and then quote, quote, close quote, quote. That's called a null alt tag or attribute, really. And that essentially says I am purposely not using alternative text. If, on the other hand, you don't specify alt at all, so if you just go alt and then there's nothing, sorry, you have the image and you don't have the alt tag in there, then what happens is the screen reader will make its own mind up. And usually what it'll do is it will read the file name of the image, which is terrible. So you end up, I think BBC News has this somewhere. So you can end up with a news article and you're trying to read the news article and they tell you a file name of an image that has like 4,000 characters in it. So there's a big difference between saying you don't have alt text for an image on purpose and just missing it out because you didn't have that specified, right? So that is a significant difference, and the tool should correctly identify that. They may flag the image for consideration manually to make sure it's appropriate, which is what we do, but they definitely shouldn't flag the absence if it's deliberate of alt text. Hope that helps.
Next question is, how much detail should you go into for describing what's in a table?
Okay, well, that kind of depends on the table. So there's a whole range of ways you can describe tabular data. So there's many, sorry, there's like literally 100 ways you can interpret this question. If you, for example, had an image of a table, that's very difficult and I generally wouldn't recommend it. If you can use a HTML table, I'm going to assume that's what you're doing. If you're using HTML correctly for the table, so you've got like a header row and you're defining the table header and body, and the table isn't complicated, you're usually okay. That's sufficient. If the table does something really weird with column spans and diagonal columns and all sorts of crazy stuff, it gets harder. I would try and avoid those. If you have no other choice, providing a annotation or like almost the equivalent of a transcript underneath can work. the same thing for charts. So if you've got a chart and it's like 50% of people suffer from whatever, and 25% of people have this, and you can have the chart and you can just make sure the same information is included in the text and you're okay. Honestly, the answer to your question really depends far too much on the specifics of the table, so I can't really go much beyond that. Hopefully that helps.
So then we've also got another question from Monica. She's asked, we've been told that PDFs are generally not accessible with screen readers, and the Gov digital standards advise that they be removed. Do you agree with this?
100% and then some. No, PDFs are, so if anyone here is, I hesitate to use the word old, if anyone here is old enough to remember Flash, Flash animation, now widely seen as a scourge of the internet. PDFs are basically Flash, but for print. They are impossibly inaccessible technologies. The only reason anyone even pretends that they're vaguely accessible is because they're so widely used that it's unpalatable to think that they might not be. But honestly, everyone, GDS certainly is not the only organization to say that. The irony is, of course, GDS says that you should never use PDFs, but at the same time, they will freely admit they add, I think, 10,000 of them a month to their own sites, and they know it. But it's really hard to get rid of PDFs, but they are legitimately awful for accessibility. It's very, very hard to make good accessible PDFs, and even when you do it perfectly, it's not that good of an experience. If at all possible, I would just do everything in HTML. I know that isn't always practical. There are tools that can help you. There are practices that you can talk about where you can go into the details of making PDFs accessible, but to be honest, that will probably have to be a separate talk.
And then Joanne's requested to have a copy of the presentation. So Oliver, if you're able to send it to myself, I can then get this passed on to members if that's okay.
Sure, happy to, no problem.
And then another one we've got is, will this be available to be watched again? And I think it would be useful to send around our content authors. Again, we're happy to do that. We'll upload it to the dashboard. Can you suggest courses or online resources to help educate my team on accessibility?
Yes, I can potentially provide a couple of links. There's actually a few in the slides here. So, oh, sorry, I've kind of lost the screen here. But if you were in, for example, this one earlier, right? So I've actually based that on a really good article here from WebAIM, which is actually probably the best article ever written on alternative text. So if you want to go into that, it's pretty intense. But yeah, you've certainly got the option if you want. You'll get those from the slides.
And then we've got another question. Can you recommend any screen reading software for e-learning?
Not quite sure what that means. Sorry, specifically. Screen readers. There's about 4 or well, maybe 5 major ones, and they depend far more on what kind of computer device you're using. So, if, for example, you're using a Apple computer, you tend to use VoiceOver. If you're using Windows, you tend to use JAWS or NVIDIA, or if you're using Google, they have their own, I forget the name. Apple has a different voiceover for the iPhone, etc. So it's usually determined more by that than it is by the kind of the use of like what you're aiming to achieve. There's quite a lot of good guides out there to using those. I would just pick the device that you're most comfortable with. Often it's your phone, and you'll have a free screen reader installed on every Apple computer and every iPhone and iPad. And if you're using Android, there's a free equivalent, I forget the name of, that you can Google for and install again for free. So I wouldn't, yeah, I wouldn't say it's specific to the field. It's more just to the device.
And then Jonathan's asked, does making a table responsive pass accessibility 2-dimensional scroll?
It's definitely a requirement of it. You can make, there's so many ways you can make a table handle 2D scrolling. You can make, to be honest, you can make tables scroll in 2 dimensions in some cases. It's justifiable. Basically, the requirements make exceptions where the format of the data is clearly appropriate to use 2-dimensional scrolling. So, for example, Google Maps uses 2D scrolling, right? Because there's no way you can fit the entire world into the width of your mobile phone, and it would be counterproductive to do it. So it's not that it's not allowed, but it's just as a general rule, you probably want to avoid it. It's not a good experience for anyone to try and read a table and have to scroll, hundreds of columns to the right and then left and then up and down. That's never great. So I try and avoid it if you can, but it's not impossible if you have no choice.
And then the last question's from Bruce, and he said, gov.uk does not use icons on landing pages. What is your advice on using icons? Are they helpful for users or not?
So they are particularly helpful for, say, dyslexic users. So if you remember that simulation you had earlier, I'm trying to think of it. I don't need to go to a website here, but if you have dyslexia simulation, turn it on, right? One of the things about this is it makes it so much easier. You see these little flags here by the French and German on the right-hand side? Because you've got those flags, it's so much easier to know what's going on because that imagery helps, and it's not compromised by the effect you're seeing here. So it helps there. It's not like essential. I think Gov.uk gets around it because they just write brilliant copy and they keep everything really simple. But the occasional icon that adds useful context is great. And even when they don't use icons, they do tend to use occasionally images like this, which are, again, it's helpful, right? So it just makes it clearer. Well, sometimes it makes it clearer that they've got maybe the red box for the budget than just having the word budget. So yeah, I think they work hard to stay minimal. That's the thing.
And I haven't got any more questions. I don't know if you've got any sent privately in your chat box, Oliver.
I have not been looking. Hold on. 1 second. No, doesn't look like it. I don't think so. No, I'm good. Okay, well, I think that was everything we had today. So thank you very much for your time, everyone. Lauren, yeah, I'd really appreciate a copy of the video if you could send that over to me when you've got it, and feel free to share it with anyone else. I'll send you over the slides in the next 5-10 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you ever so much.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye.
Bye.